All right. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dave Frincke. I'm here with Rachel Wilhelm and Ryan Flanigan. And we're excited to be able just to chat today about our songwriting journeys and what we're seeing and hopefully encouraging people today. So, Rachel, welcome. And Ryan, welcome. Ryan, you wear multiple hats. Local musician, songwriter, founder of Liturgical Folk, and of course working with us at United Adoration. So it'll be fun to kind of dive into all those different hats and how you make sense of all those things at one time. So thanks for carving out time to be with us for sure.
Of course.
Mm-hmm. But I think, one of the places we like to start when we have these chats is just about, Ryan, just your songwriting journey and how did you start? Were there any memorable moments along the way? Some things you learned? You just want to chat about that for a little bit, and where did you start writing?
Well, I started writing songs when I was in about fourth grade. I was probably 9 years old, maybe 10 years old. I remember I was taking piano lessons, and it occurred to me at one point when I was getting bored with rehearsing or practicing that I could write my own music on the piano. So I started doing that. It was fifth grade. I remember I was probably 11 years old, and I wrote a little song, and I remember just being so proud of it.
Do you remember what it was about, or was it just music?
It was not word. There were no words. It was an instrumental song. In fact, for a few years, that's all I did, just instrumental songs. Actually, for many years, all I did were instrumental pieces. Because when you're playing piano, you don't, at least I didn't, I wasn't playing songs that you sang to. I was playing classical pieces that were instrumental, So that's how I associated songwriting from the beginning with composition, melodies. There were no words involved, which, come to think of it, that would explain a lot.
Yeah, that really does.
Yeah, I just realized that. So grateful for this.
We're here to help, man. So
yeah. So for several years, in the beginning of my songwriting journey, I just wrote instrumental pieces on piano. It was later in high school. I think it was the summer between my junior year and senior year of high school when I went to a youth camp, and it was the first time I experienced, this was the early 90s, maybe the mid 90s, I experienced a praise band singing Hillsong. It was this new thing. I think the big song was, I will never be the same again. I can never return. I've closed the door. It was probably from one of their first albums, global albums. And I was watching the worship leader, and I was like, wait a minute, I could do that. So I went back to my youth pastor, or I went home and I got on the piano and I started singing. I learned the chords, whatever, and started singing that song. Went to my youth pastor and I said, hey, I think I'd like to try leading music for youth group. And of course, I was already in the practice of composing my own songs on the piano. So I was like, well, why don't I just start putting words to the songs? And that's when the whole worship songwriting thing kind of entered the scene for me. It was the beginning of my senior year of high school. And from there, I just haven't really looked back. I led worship and wrote songs for my youth group. I remember just writing songs constantly. And almost every song that I wrote was for worship. And let's see, I'll try to
get a chance to use them in youth group. Was that oh, that's cool.
Yep, immediately. I would write it and use it immediately.
What was that experience like? Just because among your peers, right?
Right. I mean, it was just like the first song I wrote. That feeling of pride, and it was just so life-giving. To be making something and watching 100 kids worship God with this thing that I made. It was incredibly life-giving. And I think any artist knows that feeling of bringing something into the world that didn't exist before, right? That now exists. And in art, and in my case, it wasn't only just there for people to look at and listen to and enjoy. It was for people to actually engage in worship with God through, right? So that's where sort of my, theology of art or creation really started taking a pretty strong position in the realm of like what I'm making is for the glory of God.
Yeah.
Right. It's not just for some kind of enjoyment or pleasure or mantelpiece decoration. It's for the glory of God. And it was easy for me to make that connection because people were singing my songs in worship as they were worshiping and glorifying God. So, yeah.
That's
how I got started.
Right away, as a songwriter trying things out, you had a supportive community around you. You had a youth pastor that I assume was encouraging you. And what a cool way to start that journey,
Yep. Thanks, Pastor John. Appreciate it.
Do you still talk with him?
Yeah, I see him on Facebook all the time. Maybe he's watching this.
Oh, nice. That's like a payday for youth pastors, isn't it? Like when they see one of their kids like grow up doing cool stuff for the Lord. That's great.
I'm sure.
So what happened after youth group?
Well, I traveled with a small orchestra and vocal ensemble called the Celebrant Singers for a year or so, for a couple of terms. Several of my Celebrant friends and alumni are probably also watching this. And I did that for a while. I brought a guitar with me, and so I was always writing songs while I was on a tour bus traveling around the U.S. and Central and South America. And that was also a very important piece of my journey because we were ministering mainly in the Roman Catholic Church. And so having grown up Pentecostal, I was born Catholic, but I was raised Pentecostal. And going into the Catholic Church then and experiencing music in the liturgy was mostly unconsciously formational for me. I just remember singing the story of God, enacting the story of God and the practices of worship as a 19-year-old, 20-year-old kid. And I just remember the beauty of and the mystery and just how, I just remember the aesthetic and how, and looking back, I can see how that aesthetic and those historic practices really shaped the direction that I would then take for in songwriting. Yeah, and so traveled with them for a bit, Celebrant Singers. Came back home, continued leading worship at my church in the youth group, but also for the adults because they were in kind of an interim period between pastors. And then I followed in the footsteps of 3 of my youth pastors and went to Christ for the Nations Institute in Dallas. That's how I was introduced to the city of Dallas. And now I live less than a mile away from Christ for the Nations.
Oh, wow.
It's really funny. But went to Christ for Nations. Christ for Nations is a kind of a bastion of contemporary praise and worship music. Some great songs, choruses have been written there over the years. I believe As the Deer has roots in Christ the Nations. Lord, you are more precious than silver.
Yeah.
I will enter his gates with thanksgiving. But, a lot of those kind of Jewish sounding, I will celebrate, sing unto the Lord.
Love that stuff. I love it.
I know.
That's my childhood right there.
Right. Well, and it's also like the original liturgical folk music.
It really is.
It's something that just it connects to a much deeper level in you, those rhythms, those modes. It does something in you immediately deeper than something that might be trying to force its way into you from the outside. We could talk more about that in a bit.
Yeah, we definitely need to talk more about that. Yeah.
Well,
we should.
Go ahead.
Let's do it now, because so we don't lose that train. So talk more about that. What do you mean? How do you feel the difference between something that forces its way onto you, music-wise, as opposed to something that's,
bubbling up?
Yeah.
Right. That's a good way of putting it. Bubbling up. I call it the sound in the ground, or the music in the bones. It's the kind of sound. I'm not even talking about words at this point. Just the sound, the rhythm, the melody, the tone, the tune. It does something. It communicates to the soul in a more immediate and deep way, in such a way that the soul is connected to God effortlessly, and souls in a place are connected to one another when this sound is made known, and it creates an accessibility to spiritual things. I think that it's just effortless. This is the whole foundation of the philosophical idea of liturgical folk. We put our ear, as an artist, it's my responsibility to put my ear to the ground and to listen for that sound that's in the place, and to capture that sound in a song or in a melody, and rhythms, and then to present it or reflect that out to the people. I'm convinced that if we do that, if an artist can do that effectively, it's going to lead people more immediately and effectively into an encounter with God in worship. Now, the opposite of that would be the kind of sound that is that tries to force its way into you from the outside, rather than bubbling up from within. It's sort of it's a force. An artist is trying to sort of force the sound into you. I think the best example nowadays is probably EDM music, right? EDM music, electronic dance music. It's just pounding, right? Pounding, and the way that they create kind of a dislocation in the human being is they suck everything out for a bit, and then they and building up to this drop, which I don't know if you guys have seen the new Trolls movie, but one of the opening scenes. The opening scene is so great. It's just this it's this farce of what EDM music does emotionally to the person, and then this feels like, oh, wait for it, and then the drop, and everyone's face is just like, highly recommend the new Trolls movie.
Oh my gosh.
If you're just listening to this, you really missed out on the visual in Ryan's face right there.
Hey, I'm pretty sure they can just rewind, and most of the time you're able to do that. So just make sure you pause it right at the right moment and take a screenshot and then upload it. The music that forces its way, it tries to force its way in. And I think the best that music does for us is it kind of hits our skin, gives us goosebumps, right? But it doesn't do much more than that. It kind of falls off to the ground, and then you have to do it again. You have to like try to experience that again. And not only that, but like the industry, the artists have to keep one-upping themselves, right? They have to keep going bigger and bigger, bigger, bigger. And I think we've actually seen this in the church. If we want to take another rabbit trail. We've seen this sort of like this need to go more intense, more intense, more intense, more intense, more intense. And it sort of has led us to this place where like we barely have any more room to go up.
Octave shifts, key changes,
right?
That
so
kind of thing.
Melodically, it's like the intensity, just the visual aesthetic of the rooms of worship. Like how much crazier can we make it? Now there's churches that have like an IMAX screen kind of going over the front row of the people, and it's just how much higher, how much more intense, how much more forceful, I think, can we make it. Now some people can sort of argue that this is a form of art and people are putting their creativity into it, and that's true, but I think that fundamentally there's a difference between the kind of sounds, the kind of aesthetic that just effortlessly comes into being and engages in the soul of the human being.
So I think maybe you're talking also about like at the local level, like what speaks to people, a community at the local level rather than on a global level. So kind of how I interpret some of what you're saying is, like big names, the radio dictates what the local level church sings on a Sunday, and what the local level artist / music director sings with the congregation on a Sunday. And what you're saying is, at the local level, if we listen to the local level rather than listening to the global, then we're gonna speak to the local level so much better, to the soul.
Yeah, I think so. And there's definitely some cross-cultural, just cross-cultural things going on. I mean,
sure.
Any human being is like 99.9% the same as the next human being, right?
Sure.
As far as their makeup and all this stuff. Now there's personality differences and cultural differences and all these different things, but like there's definitely some crossover. But yeah, that's essentially what I'm saying is interpret your place. Yes. Where are you? Like contextualize the situation. Are you in a liturgical church? Are you in a very free, kind of spontaneous sort of church? What kind of people are here? What sort of gifts has God given this church instrumentally, musically?
Amen.
And like how big is our church, right? So I went to a church one time in Florida, and clearly their pastors had been to some mega crazy amazing conference, and were sort of presented with this picture of what the ideal church is. And they came home and they said, we need to start doing this. The problem was there were only like 50 people in the church, and they bought these huge motion lights, and kind of created this mega arena sort of experience that you might experience at a U2 concert or something. The problem was the space was so small and the community was so small that the motors of the lights were louder than the voices of the people singing, right? So it was like, you could hear that.
Wow.
So anyway, what would have served that pastoral team well is to interpret our situation instead of trying to mimic what these amazingly huge arena sort of experienced churches are doing, and sort of presenting as like this is the ideal. Instead, they could have said, all right, well, what kind of musicians do we have here? What sort of size do we have? What sort of space do we have? What sort of funds, budget, whatever, do we have here? And let's shape our ministry, our music around that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the super practical level. I usually think more in kind of philosophical terms. And I think about like, well, you know, where are you in the United States or in the world? Are you in the South or are you in the North? What kind of sounds have sort of seeped into the soil of this community, of this place?
How do you as an artist, how do you put some of these things into practice? Besides, you know, like being aware of your surroundings, being aware of the environment that you've been placed and planted in. How do you as an artist bring out then that sound? Because how much of it is already in you? How much of it then, but is trying to serve the people to where you're placed, if that makes sense? Because the two don't always go together, and that's what's interesting about leadership and servanthood in the church, especially for the artist, that you might best serve your church in ways that aren't your favorite.
Yeah.
That's a great question. I mean, there's definitely to be a servant. There's definitely a subservience that needs to happen with any artist in any place, unless you're just totally autonomous and independent and you can do whatever you want and you're able to make money that way. There, especially in the church, there needs to be, like you said, Dave, a servant heart. Like, what are the needs here, and how do my artistic gifting, how do I meet that need in a way that's going to be a ministry and effective in leading this community, this particular community. Now, I think that there's always a tension between like how much do we want to stretch the muscles, the artistic muscles of our church, and you know, without that sort of that pull, you can sort of just slip into a very accommodating or not a very challenging environment at all artistically, and so, and then there's also this and we'll get into the practicalities of it a little bit, but there may come a time when your core conviction about, particularly about worship or theology or art, or your core gifting, like what you have to bring to the community, evolves to a degree that it doesn't match, or it doesn't.
Right.
It sort of misses the vision of that community that you're in, right? It's really hard to discern. I'm speaking from experience because it took me about 3 years. It took me 7 years at my last church. I was at my last church for 7 years. And to no one's fault or blame, whatever, my own theology of worship and sort of philosophy of ministry had evolved or progressed, or whatever you want to say, to a place, and I will intentionally put it higher because it was more of a high church vision, right? Where like my vision was just not my gift, who I was, it just didn't match anymore with what the church needed. Like the church needed to be led at this level, and I was trying to lead them at this level And, you know, on the scale of, you know, whether, on the scales of calling, like, am I called to be a part of this place? Has God called me to be here? Vocationally, I had, it took me 3 years and some very dark nights, a very dark night of the soul, and some really good pastoring to lead me to the discernment that it's time for me to become part of another community where I am, where my gifts are going to be to meet that same vision of that particular place. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, I mean, that's huge. I mean, that's huge. And that's where, like, there's, you know, the Holy Spirit has us all on these individual journeys. And I think, you know, we learn, even in, I think all of us have probably served in churches that we felt mismatched at some point along the way. But until the Lord releases you and sends you somewhere else, you know, we have this humbling of, okay, how do I serve these people? You know, where I'm placed, and trust that the Lord will, you know, the path the Lord has for us will, you know, will take us when the time is right to the next assignment.
Right.
And, you know, the cool thing.
Perhaps be giving people any ideas.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of discernment, and the last thing that you want to do is just because you don't like what the church is asking you to do, like you flee, you bolt, like that's the last thing you want to do.
Right.
That's the unhealthiest thing that you can do. Sometimes it's important to flee from a situation or whatever, if it's abusive or whatever, but we don't want to just flee whenever we're asked to do something that we don't want to do.
That's right.
In fact, for probably for the last 4 years that I was at the church, my last church, and I'm sure some of these people are on Facebook too watching, all of my relationships from that season of life are great, so I have nothing to hide.
Right.
But for the last 3 years there, what I was really suffering with was discontentment. I had no joy in what I was doing, because what I was being asked to do was like at this level down here, not up here. This mirroring feature on this that makes it very difficult to know, like, where my hands are. So down here is where the vision of the church is. This is where they need to be led. Like, I needed to meet them here.
Yeah. And when you say down here, it doesn't mean like,
inferior.
Yeah, it doesn't mean inferior. Or,
you just mean a different place.
Yeah, different.
Right. You can flip-flop these, and the point is that I was missing. I wasn't, what I was bringing, how I was trying to lead was missing how they needed to be led. And so it left a lot of people just kind of scratching their heads, or
right,
like, and the reason for that is because I didn't have the maturity, maybe, or there was sin in me to sort of push forward my agenda, my vision. And that was the root of the discontentment. I wasn't being faithful to the people that God called me to be leading, right? I was trying to push them up to like a higher church, liturgical place, right? When what they needed was this. And so, again, what I felt was, I felt like I was only able to move in like 10% of what God was calling me to do, vocationally, right? And I would spend 90% of my time like pushing a boulder up a hill by myself, right?
Yeah.
And that's where ultimately the discernment, very careful pastoral discernment, led me to that place where, you know what, vocationally, it's probably important for me now to become part of a community where my core convictions meet what the church needs, right? But it didn't come, like God didn't release me from that until I confessed that sin of insistence, and I sort of confessed my discontent. I confessed to my church one Sunday morning in the fall of 2013 that I had been for 2 years, when I'd pull into the parking lot on Sunday morning, it was the last place in the world I wanted to be, because I just took no joy in what I was doing. Like, what they needed me to do, it's in my very limited sort of imagination for ministry, I felt like what they needed me to do at that church was just to provide awesome music on Sunday, right? And I wanted the church to have so much more. But you know what? What they needed from me was to lead awesome music on Sunday morning. That's what they needed from me, and I wasn't willing to do it with joy in my heart. And until I humbled myself, confessed my sin to the whole church, and then the Lord restored my joy in playing awesome music on Sunday morning, like, and serving the church in that way. It wasn't until then that the Lord released me from that place to take me to the next.
That's a huge point for all of us artists that we need to remember and grab a hold of. And I'm curious too, because we as a movement, United Adoration, one of the topics that we increasingly talk about is the relationship between artists and their pastors. Are there any appropriate things you can share with us about how you interacted with your pastor as you were feeling that and as you discerned to transition away?
I'm still very good friends with him, and it's a miracle, honestly. I think because it was hard. I mean, it was so slow and so hard to do it with to walk through it in a communal way, to invite others into the discernment process, and it in some ways it's a lot easier just to kind of make the decision for yourself, to say and then to like hand in your notice.
Yeah. I've fallen into that trap when I was young. It made it very a private issue.
And it's the business way of doing it, right? Mm-hmm. If you see your job as kind of the way you make money, right? That's the corporate model for do your skills meet the needs of this position? If not, you're fired, or if I'm unhappy here, then I'm going to go find somebody who appreciates my skills. What I learned, I think, through that, and it was a learning curve for everyone. It was a learning curve for the elder board. It was a learning curve for the senior pastor, for me, for everyone involved. It was the church is not called to function in the same way as the corporate world when it comes to business decisions, or however you want to. Like, the church is it's called to mutual discernment. It's called to mutual submission, to make really hard decisions together.
Yep.
And it took us at least 6 months, but probably 9 months of like really hard conversations, to one-on-one with the senior pastor, me in front of the elder board. Like, some of our systems, our policies, our structures were set up against the very thing that the very faithful and healthy way that we were trying to go about this.
Yeah.
And so there was always just such like explanation and teaching, and like almost 90% of a meeting would be sort of deconstructing the environment that we currently find ourselves in and the policies in the system. And then we could spend the last 10 minutes like trying to communicate openly with one another and discern together and sort of thing. And the Lord was faithful in all of that to safeguard relationships and ultimately, you know, to lead us out of that community and into the Anglican Church. For me, that's what it was. It was to be led then into this historic liturgical worshiping community. And let me say this, even though you have another question. I want to say this because United Adoration played such an important role in this process for me. It was it 2014?
Yep, fall of 2014.
Yeah. So I had already made the decision to transition out. I should say we had already discerned that God was calling me out of that church, but I hadn't yet discerned fully where he was calling us to. And when I met you, Dave, and at that very first United Adoration songwriting retreat, which I'll never forget.
Oak Park, Illinois.
It was amazing. I mean, there was something so special about that. And it was at Cornerstone Anglican Church. And I just remember you handing us this packet of prayers from the Book of Common Prayer. And I was already somewhat familiar with the Book of Common Prayer because I studied with Robert Weber several years prior to that, 8 years prior to that. And he gave me a Book of Common Prayer. And about a month before the retreat, in preparation for the retreat, I took out the Book of Common Prayer, knowing roughly what we were going to be doing. And I wrote a song based on the On Use Day. Lord, 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 please restore our trust.
I love that song so much.
Still sing it at Heartland.
Aw, thanks.
Very often.
And something, I mean, it was just another piece of the journey. It was just, for me, in which God was blessing me and saying, hey, you have a place, you have a calling, and it was new for me, right? It was a new world. I set like some scriptures before that, but I'd never taken it a historic prayer, to my knowledge, and set it to music, like I did with that prayer. And then at the retreat, of course, that's what it was all about. And it was like God was affirming this new era for me of songwriting. And so I just wanted to point out that UA, United Adoration, was a godsend. And it was my friend Justice who invited me to that, and I didn't know you. He gave me your CD, Dave. He gave me the Eucharist CD. And I remember listening to it thinking, man, this guy is cool.
Little did you know.
That you were cooler?
And that's even before I ever saw a picture of you, Dave. Imagine how tired the cool factor went up after I made it. Cool. I don't know if cool is the right word. I think after I met you, David, I changed the word from cool to quirky.
I'll take that.
Yeah.
I'll take that any day. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I was going to say, because a lot of people don't know that, you and I met, and a lot of others at that first retreat that we ever did for United Adoration. And And you were right at that transitionary point. And that's, that was when we first met. And one of the cool things about like sacred space and, the retreats that we do is that there's space for community to be built and to hear each other's stories and journeys and learn how to walk with each other. And I just remember, and I know you had conversations with a lot of other people too, but just about sitting down at the table, eating, and just talking about this journey that you were in the midst of at that moment, and how we just, lots of people that retreat got to pray with you and stand with you. And I know it's so cool now that, 6 years later, 5.5 years later, just to see, fruit of relationship, fruit of community, as so many people take the next step into their calling and their assignments from the Lord. And that's, to me, this is such a beautiful thing. So much more important than having a name on a record and, having a publishing deal and going, all that kind of stuff, is that actually being in an encouraging community together of artists who want each other to follow the Lord.
So I hope you feel like my youth pastor felt. Dave.
Oh, aren't you older than me though? I mean,
we're not going to talk about that.
I'm 38.
Okay.
Rachel is our elder.
Oh, you little punk! Yeah. No, that's okay. Everyone that was born in 1977 is the best kind of person anyway. So
I think we're all technically zennials.
Probably. Yeah. So Ryan, I'm going to ask the next question. Get out of here, Dave. So let's talk about Liturgical Folk a little bit. You segued into UA, and I know UA had some influence on Liturgical Folk. You moved to a different church called All Saints Dallas. I'll just transition into that. And tell us the story about how Liturgical Folk got started. We kind of have a good foundation now. So
yeah, it was, the United Adoration retreat in Oak Park 2014 was so encouraging to me that I then immediately went back and just started writing all kinds of songs from the prayer book, just straight out of the prayer book. I set the song twos, and I was setting some of the collects, and at the next retreat, we wrote our setting to the Gloria, which we use all the time. Me and two other guys, Scotty and Derek.
I love it.
And so that became half of what Liturgical Folk is. The settings, these liturgical settings, setting ancient prayers to new tunes. But it was a month, maybe a month and a half after that retreat in 2014, where I was actually offered the position at All Saints Dallas, because I was in the interview process and all that stuff. And we moved down the first of the year, 2015, for me to start at All Saints. So about a month into my job at All Saints, so in February of 2015, I got an email from a parishioner, and the title of the email was Request.
I love this.
That's every worship leader's dream email.
It is.
Yes. I imagine anyone in ministry just loves receiving emails that just say request. It might as well say complaint. Me and my family are reading Exodus right now, and my kids are just getting a kick out of how much the children of Israel are complaining. So it just said request. I opened the email, not expecting much, of course, and I start reading, and whoever this person is already apologizing for what he's about to request. And you don't have to do anything with this, but the lections for this coming Sunday are the story of the Transfiguration, and here's a poem for for the Transfiguration. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to do anything with this, but if you did want to do something with it, it would fit really nicely as a gradual hymn, blah blah blah, and you could use the tune of Amazing Grace because it's in common meter, and blah blah blah. And so, oh my God, great, here we go. So I read it, and in reading it, it was a beautiful poem, and I was like, I got the time, so I picked up my guitar and I wrote a little folk tune. It was in common meter. And it took me, 10 minutes. So I wrote a tune to this poem and sent it back to him and said, hey, thanks for sending me that poem. Here's what I did with it. By the way, who wrote it? And because he hadn't said that in the email. And he, shortly later, he replied back and said, I'm sitting here with my wife in tears listening to this.
Oh.
He said, I'm blown away that you would do something with this. I wrote the poem, and I'm just tickled pink. And then he told me a little bit about himself. He's a retired priest, Father Nelson Kashevsky. And I replied back, and I said, you wrote this poem. Do you have any more poems? Because there's partnership happening here.
Yeah.
And he said, no, I don't. But since I'm a retired priest, I just pray all day long. So why don't I just start versifying my prayers, and I'll send you what I come up with.
Wow.
And so we started writing hymns together all the time. We wrote probably within the first couple of months, we wrote about 6 hymns together, and we were singing them immediately. I've always been in communities where as soon as I write a song, if I think it's appropriate to sing, or that it will work, if I'm like 75% sure that it's going to work, then I'll do it, right? I'll use it right away, immediately. And so most of the hymns that we wrote from the beginning, we did in worship immediately. So by the middle of 2015, it was probably like closer to the middle of the beginning of 2016. We've probably written a dozen hymns. People started asking, when are you gonna record these? And I'm like, when are you gonna give me money to record them? And so through another important, awesome relationship with a guy in Nashville, a publisher, Malcolm Duplessis, I was connected to Isaac Wardell. He said, you guys are both quirky, so I'm going to connect you together. So he connected us together, and Isaac and I struck up a partnership. This was the middle of 2016. And so by the fall of 2016, we had enough content, between the liturgical settings that I'd been writing for a couple of years and these hymns, we had tons of content to record. And I asked Isaac if he'd be willing to record 2 albums at once. And he said, yeah, it'd be a lot more efficient, and so let's do it. So that's fall of 2016, we recorded the first 2 volumes of Liturgical Folk. And from the beginning, the idea, our vision was we don't want to get locked into one particular kind of song. And so let's release these liturgical settings, table settings, and Eden Land, the album with new hymns, at the same time, and say, Liturgical Folk is writing all different kinds of songs, right? And from the beginning, I had the goal of recording and releasing 6 volumes in 3 years. That was my ambitious little goal.
Very ambitious. So the quality that you did them in. I mean, if you have not heard these 6 projects, you need to go on Spotify right now and go listen to them, because they're just incredible.
Thank you.
Just a plug for you, just a little plug.
I second that.
We want to get you, 2 to 5 more cents today in your streaming, in your streaming account.
Appreciate that. Bandcamp, actually, go to Bandcamp and buy
and buy them.
They're actually, they've waived their whatever, their fee, I think.
They're waiving, yeah.
For a while. So that was the goal. And the idea, my hope was, and by the way, it was Malcolm Plessy who came up with the name Liturgical Folk. He was trying to pinpoint, when he heard, it was actually a previous album that I did called Fought and Fallen. When he heard that, he was trying to put his finger on the genre. He's like, what do you call this music? And then he said, I know what I call it, liturgical folk. So he was sort of categorizing it, right? But I love the name, and so I asked him. I was like, hey, do you mind if I use this name, Liturgical Folk, for our music project? He said, sure. So I bought the domain. So we got liturgicalfolk.com. And so my hope was that if we can produce as much content as we possibly can under this category of liturgical folk, knowing full well that we're not the creators of liturgical folk. We already mentioned that those Jewish songs from the 80s that was liturgical folk music, right? Celtic spiritual music is liturgical folk music, right? Liturgical folk music has always been a part of culture, right? And even today, as far as modern Christian worship, liturgical songwriters, people have been doing it long before we have. We just named it, right? And so my hope was, if we can produce as much content as possible, critical mass of content, and just throw it at the wall of the church, right? And see if it sticks. That looks like maybe it'll stick. Maybe the vision for what music can be in the church, maybe the imagination of the church for what is appropriate music will expand a little bit, right? And perhaps churches won't feel that they need to conform to this particular model that's being presented to them, or this particular model, the two really successful sides of church music, right? The misnomers, but you could call it the contemporary or the traditional. Maybe there's a huge majority of churches in the middle that don't have the resources to pull this off or this off, right? But they do have a young person who plays an acoustic guitar and a guy who's been longing to hit his djembe, right? And maybe folk music, or something a lot closer to the ground, is what's going to connect much better with this particular community. And so the idea, our hope was to expand the imagination of appropriate music for the church, and for this music project, Liturgical Folk, to just sort of be an agent in that expansion.
Well, and Liturgical Folk has this beautiful dual meaning as well, doesn't it? I mean, obviously it speaks to a genre, but I just love the other way to think about it, like liturgical folk, like people. Makes me, it always made me happy. So
it is a happy word. It sounds happy. Unless you're super afraid of the word liturgical.
Oh.
People are getting less afraid of the word. But I mean, it was important to sort of redefine worship, because I think the word worship has been kind of co-opted and redefined for generations to mean contemporary worship music. That's what worship means when you say, "Hey man, let's worship." What most people in the modern church would understand that to mean is, let's sing some songs with electric guitars and drums, right? Or acoustic guitars and drums. Remember Enter the Worship Circle?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that?
Oh yeah.
That was novel to me. I remember when I heard it, I was like, whoa, like acoustic guitar and drums in worship instead of this whole praise band situation.
Yeah, it's like MTV Unplugged.
Yeah, I'm sure there was nothing really novel about it.
No one knows what MTV Unplugged is except us, you know.
I'm too young.
Yeah, I was allowed to watch MTV, but
I did it anyway. I don't know.
Yeah.
I did whatever I wanted.
But so Ryan, when you made these, so I mean, you did tours when you came out with these projects, and I loved how you did the tours, that you based them on seasons of the year and things like that. But like, what did you learn when you went around and did these shows that would be pretty intimate shows, from the outside looking in, which is really cool. Like, what did you learn when you did your touring?
So I learned that this genre is intergenerational. I think it appeals, and not in a consumeristic sort of way, but it like engages the older folks or the seasoned folks and the children first. And I think that's because, and this isn't something I guess it's something I discovered, but it was more like a hypothesis I already had that was proved to be true. The younger people, the kids and the older folks, are living the most down-to-earth lives. They're the ones in the room who aren't as cluttered as we are, like in the middle of our lives with young kids and trying to figure out schooling and how to feed people. And I mean, it's just like kids and older folks are just a lot simpler. They have less clutter. And I think life, I'm going to try to do this on the screen properly. Life is a bell curve.
Oh,
Okay?
Very nice. Very nice.
Of simplicity and clutter, right? Wait. Clutter. Simplicity down here. Gosh. And I'm going to read myself here. And if you draw a threshold, like close to the bottom, like that. Wait. If you draw a line across this bell curve, everyone below the line, which are the people at the beginning and the end of life, they're the ones who are like able to access the most stripped away sorts of things. Right? I think that their souls are a lot more kind of readily accessible. And so if we aim, as music leaders in the church, if we aim our music engagement below that threshold to engage the people at the end of life and the people at the beginning of life, there's going to be a much greater chance, I think, of being effective in our ministry. So what we learned when we went around on the road is, like the older folks just loved it. I mean, they were like eating it up and shocked too. I remember one lady at one of our concerts. We always do a Q&A time, and during the Q&A time, she raised her hand and she's like, "I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to say, I love your sound." And she was like shocked by that she liked it. And I was like, okay, well, if you don't have a question for us, can I ask you a question? I said, are you the kind of person who would prefer more traditional music, like organ and choir? And that's, oh yes, absolutely. That's what I prefer in worship. That's all I like anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, and I said, okay. I said, but would you describe the music that we just did as traditional? No, I wouldn't describe it as traditional. Would you describe it as contemporary? No, not at all. I wouldn't describe it as contemporary. Because in her mind, like the whole banging on drums and the whole contemporary thing was not appealing at all. It didn't engage her, right? She syncopated, or she couldn't do the octave leap. And so when she said that, I was like, yeah, mission accomplished, right? We've done what we've set out to do. We've set out, in a sense, and not like super intentionally, it's just what came out of us, but we're not on the same pole. Like, I don't think this project or this genre or whatever, I don't think what we're talking about is part of this worship war of, traditional versus contemporary. I think that it's functioning on a very different plane. I think it exists on a different sort of plane. And I would hope that it's a kingdom plane, right? In which, much like the idea of the new heavens and the new earth, right? There's such an earthiness to it, but we forget that when we think that when we sort of, I'm gonna use a big word, it's not even a word, gnosticize, when we sort of detach our spirituality from our humanity, then we start trying to create these grandiose heavenly sounds with sort of otherworldliness, and I think that there's appropriateness in that. You can make beautiful art that way, but I think that the nitty gritty, I think it's gritty. I think that the sound of heaven, the sound of the kingdom, is a lot more nitty gritty than perhaps what we think it is, or what we've been presented, or maybe even what we're trying to present, in church. So that was the goal, whether it was intentional or not, and that's something that we learned on the road. I'll say this too: the facial expressions of people when they would walk into the room, not knowing anything about Liturgical Folk, but they came because their friend invited them or their church was hosting a concert, was kind of just like, what am I? This sort of inquisitive look. Why am I here? What is this going to sound like? What is this? By the fourth or fifth song, when we've already done our upbeat, joyful sort of beginning thing that we normally do, we've brought it down to this super beautiful, kind of flowy, delightful, right? And you'd see the look on their face, their facial expression change from inquisitive to kind of delight. And then by the end of the concert, when we kind of ramped it back up a little bit, and they've experienced 16 songs now in this particular style, genre, the look on their face is excitement, new possibilities. I didn't even know this was. We would hear this all the time. I'd never heard anything like that before.
Yep.
And I'm like, well, that's a shame. I don't think we're doing anything new.
Right.
I think we're just trying to recover something that has been lost in the worship wars of,
Well, I think folk music is the oldest music. King David was a folk musician. It's the oldest music, and we're just trying to recapture that and just do what we're made to do, right? We liturgical folkians.
it's kind of like these worship wars that, many of us have been a part of over the years. You have like these two sides. There's only two sides that are each trying to convert each other. And say, you're a dead religion. No, you're a dead religion. No, you're of the devil. And we think it's like you have to be on the right side and you have to choose the right one or God's mad. But what I love about what you're talking about and what we believe is that this idea of local expression, reflecting what God is doing in your local community in which you're serving. To me, that's just like throws kind of all that aside, saying, well, let's get back to foundation here for a moment. And how do we as artists share of the awe and the wonder and the mystery and the beauty of God, of what we see in my city and in my church.
And with the ingredients we have.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean we're lazy and we do it half-heartedly. It just means we have a different playbook that we're coming from. We're not trying to convert anyone or win a war, convert in regards to worship style, or win a war. We're trying to authentically, as a local church, express our worship through the gifts and the people God has given us. And I love that about your story, because I think hopefully it really inspires a lot of artists to be like, hey, man, if Ryan Flanigan can do that, why can't I champion a local sound? So Ryan, what kind of words of encouragement do you have? Would you tell artists or local musicians who are struggling?
Oh man, invite somebody into your struggle. First of all, artists have a tendency of kind of withdrawing into isolation when they're struggling. And funny, this morning in Exodus 18, Moses was trying to do all the work himself in this sort of creative community, right? He was trying to judge the people's stuff all by himself. And Jethro comes up and it's like, what are you doing? Like, you can't handle this. And then he gives them some wise advice. He basically said, invite people into. People need to surround you to help you. I think that it's hard for us, but it's the way the church works. If you're struggling as an artist, whether it's struggling with creative output or inspiration, or struggling in the place, the church that you find yourself vocationally, like I was struggling vocationally, don't do it alone. Invite somebody into that. Somebody that you trust, and somebody who loves you. Those are like the most important pieces to that. Otherwise, you can get into trouble. But if you trust this person and you know that they love you, then you want that person alongside of you to help you through whatever you're struggling with.
Yeah.
I think a lot of what we've said throughout this, it sort of serve as practical tips. The idea of serving, like you're there to serve your church, and so if you're struggling with discontentment in what you're being asked to do, I would take heart in knowing that God is the most content being in the universe. And if you haven't noticed, things aren't going exactly the way that he would wish them to go. And that might be hard for certain people with certain theological conviction to believe, but there's a lot of evil around, and yet God is on his throne and is content and loves you. So we can also find contentment, even if things aren't going exactly the way that we want them to go.
Yeah.
So,
That's good, Ryan. I know we could probably talk for hours, but it's just so thankful that you carve out, and I really think that your story and the things you learned can really be a huge benefit to the broader rate of artists. And we continue to pray that actually as a church that we'll also learn how to transition in a kingdom way, because life is full of transitions and we're not always in one place forever. We need to learn how to do it better, between artists and pastors for sure. So thank you for sharing some of the stuff you learned, and we know you're not done yet. I mean, as you said, you're only 40, man. I mean, you got a lot of years, at least 10, 15 more years.
Oh man, I am really enjoying this time of rest right now. I'm enjoying it.
Good.
Good.
I hope that you write more.
I will continue to write.
Yeah. And that you write during this crazy time too.
I am. I've written a couple canticles.
You haven't sent them to me yet, so I'm not convinced that it's done yet.
I sent you the Song of Moses. Maybe,
but you didn't send me anything else.
Well, I've written 2 pieces in the quarantine, but I was telling my wife the other day, I don't feel like, when you have a big project on your plate and you kind of have this like underlying feeling of anxiousness, and it's the last thing you think of when you go to sleep at night and the first thing you think of when you wake up in the morning. There's nothing on my plate right now.
Yeah.
That I'm just like, that's causing it, this anxiety, and it's just such a sobering time to kind of cultivate vision for the future.
Sure.
So I don't feel a ton of pressure right now to be like creating all kinds of content and all this stuff. But I can promise you that it won't stop because it's my vocation.
Yeah.
Good. The world needs to hear more of the sound that has been placed inside of you. So.
That all 3 of us and many, many others are tapping into and are reflecting out to our community.
Yeah.
Well, Ryan, thanks again, and thank everyone who's able to join us today, and look forward to chatting again.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Great to see your faces.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.
Bye.